The drive up Highway 2 through Glacier County was the kind of drive that reminded a man why he had spent 32 years saving every spare dollar he could find. The pines stood so tall they seemed to hold up the sky, and the morning light came through them in long diagonal shafts that hit the road in patches of gold and green. Jack Merritt had made this exact drive 114 times over the years he had counted them, the way a man counts good things when he understands they are not guaranteed. And every single time, without fail, the moment his old pickup crested the last ridge before the property, something inside his chest loosened. It was the same feeling every time. It was the feeling of arriving somewhere that had been waiting for him. He had been gone 7 months this time, staying in Tucson to help his daughter after the birth of her second child. And if he was honest with himself, 7 months was longer than he had intended. His daughter had needed him, and Jack Merritt was not the kind of man who weighed his own comfort against someone else's need. He had stayed as long as he was useful, patching screen doors and cooking breakfast and reading the same picture books aloud until he had them memorized. And then he had packed his single duffel bag, kissed his grandchildren on the tops of their heads, and pointed the truck north. That had been 3 days ago. He had driven through Arizona and Utah and Idaho without stopping more than he needed to, sleeping in the truck one night when he was too tired to continue and too stubborn to spend money on a motel he would leave in 6 hours anyway. He had eaten gas station sandwiches and thermos coffee and listened to the same country radio station fade in and out through 2 different states. He had thought, most of the drive, about the cabin and the lake and the specific quality of the silence on the North Shore in early morning when the mist was still on the water. He had thought about the stack of firewood he'd left against the east wall of the cabin in November and whether the tarps had held through the winter. He had thought about very little else. He was ready to be home. The property had come to him in 1993, purchased from the estate of a retired Forest Service ranger named Harold Cook, who had spent 40 years accumulating it piece by piece and another decade deciding what to do with it. Jack had been 41 years old and recently retired from a civil engineering firm in Spokane, and he had paid more for the land than anyone around him thought was sensible, which was fine because he had not asked anyone around him for an opinion. The 408 acres included a half-mile of Silver Lake shoreline, a stand of old-growth larch that he had never once considered harvesting, and a small cabin that Harold Cook had built by hand in the 1960s using timber from the property and had maintained with the obsessive care of a man who understood that a building, like anything else, returns whatever you put into it. Jack had improved the cabin over the years, a new roof, a propane system, eventually a satellite dish that his daughter had insisted upon, but the bones of it were Harold's bones, and Jack had always felt some obligation to that. He had paid his property taxes every year without fail, kept his easements current, renewed his grazing agreements even after he no longer kept cattle, and made sure that the corner monuments were accessible and clearly marked. He had been, in other words, exactly the kind of landowner whose absence is easy to take advantage of and whose records are impossible to dispute. He came around the last curve before the main gate, and his foot found the brake before his brain had finished processing what his eyes were seeing. The truck stopped in the middle of the road. Jack sat there with both hands still on the wheel and the engine idling and simply looked. The familiar line of lodgepole pines was still there on the left side of the road, the ones he had planted as seedlings 26 years ago. Measuring their spacing with a length of rope he still kept in the barn, but between them and the lakeshore there was now asphalt. Not a dirt track, not a gravel path asphalt, clean and dark, freshly laid, with bright white lane markings still crisp enough that the paint looked recent. Beyond the road there were lampposts, clean white lampposts at regular intervals, the kind you saw in planned subdivisions outside of Bozeman, and beneath each lamppost a small reflective sign with a number on it. Address numbers. Jack read them from where he sat. 14. 16, 18. The numbers continued down the line and disappeared around a bend in the new road. There was a row of identical black mailboxes at the entrance, each one mounted on its own cedar post, each one marked with a brass house number. He sat there for a full minute and said nothing, because there was nothing yet to say. He pulled the truck forward slowly, coming to a stop at what had been, until apparently very recently, the simple gravel entrance to his property. The old cedar post that had held his hand-painted sign, Merritt Private Property No Trespassing, was gone. In its place stood a handsome stone and wrought iron gate, propped open, flanked on either side by professionally landscaped native plantings. Above the gate, in raised metal letters affixed to a horizontal bar, were the words, Silver Lake Estates, a private HOA community. A smaller sign below it listed a management office number and announced, cheerfully, that this was a deed-restricted development with community standards enforced. There was a welcome mat embedded in the asphalt directly beneath the gate arch. Jack stared at the welcome mat for a long moment. The squirrels on his property, he noted distantly, understood the concept of boundaries better than whoever had built this gate. He drove through slowly, because he needed to see it with his own eyes and because some part of him was still waiting for his brain to correct itself and tell him he had made a wrong turn somewhere back on the highway. No such correction came. The road inside curved gently toward the lake, and as it curved, the houses appeared. They were large houses, not ostentatious in a garish way, but substantial. 2 stories, stone and timber facades, the kind that real estate listings described as mountain modern. Each one sat on what appeared to be about 1/3 of an acre of cleared and carefully landscaped land. The lots had been graded, seeded, and sodded. There were sprinkler systems running on 3 of the lawns, arcing over the new grass in slow mechanical rotations. A woman in athletic wear was walking a golden retriever down the sidewalk. There was a sidewalk now, a real poured concrete sidewalk, and she gave Jack's truck a pleasant wave as he passed, the uncomplicated wave of someone who assumed he belonged there. He did not wave back. He counted the houses as he drove past them. 14. 14 complete, occupied, finished homes standing on his land, with children and dogs and sprinkler systems and all the comfortable apparatus of settled domestic life already installed and running. A child on a bicycle shot across the road in front of him without looking, and Jack braked and waited, and the child vanished between 2 houses, and Jack continued driving until he reached the end of the road, where it terminated in a small paved cul-de-sac overlooking the northern shore of Silver Lake. He parked. He turned off the engine. He sat there in the quiet and looked at the water, which was exactly where he had left it, blue and cold and entirely unbothered by the events of the past 7 months. Then he took out his phone and looked up the property records for his parcel. His name was still on them. The acreage matched. The legal description matched. He compared the GPS coordinates on his phone to the coordinates listed on his deed, which he kept photographed in a folder in his cloud storage, because he was a careful man who had learned early that important documents should live in more than one place. The coordinates matched. All of it was his. Every inch of road, every lamppost, every mailbox, every blade of sod, every stone facade, every house in this community sat on land that was legally, unambiguously, and entirely his. He called Michael Hargrove before he had driven back to the gate. Michael was a real estate attorney in Kalispell, a methodical, unhurried man in his mid-50s who had handled Jack's property matters for 11 years and who did not, as a rule, use dramatic language. Jack explained what he was looking at in 3 sentences. There was a pause on the other end, the particular pause of someone recalibrating, sorting through the implications of a situation that was at once legally straightforward and practically extraordinary. Then Michael said, in a voice that was very careful and very quiet, "Jack, I need you to listen to me. Do not speak to anyone on that property. Do not engage. Do not explain. Do not accept anything anyone hands you. Drive to the end of the road, turn around, and go back to the highway. I will call you within 1 hour." Jack said, "Understood." He ended the call, turned the truck around at the cul-de-sac, drove back through the gate without looking at the welcome mat, and parked on the shoulder of the highway. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the thermos his daughter had packed for the drive, and he waited. Michael called back in 43 minutes, which was faster than the promised hour, and told Jack everything he needed to know about how seriously Michael was taking this. The attorney had pulled the parcel records and the county assessor's database before he called back, and his voice when he spoke had the specific quality of a man choosing every word with a scalpel. He confirmed what Jack had already established from his own records. The property was Jack's, had been Jack's for 31 years, and there was no encumbrance, no lien, no easement, no right-of-way, and no recorded sale or transfer of any kind on file. The title was clean. He told Jack to come to his office in Kalispell first thing in the morning and not to return to the property before then. He also told Jack to photograph everything from the highway before he left the gate, the signs, the houses visible from the road without entering. Jack did that with the methodical patience of a man who had once spent 4 years in the Army Corps of Engineers and understood that documentation was the least glamorous and most important part of any contested situation. Then he drove to Kalispell and checked into a motel. He slept better than anyone might have expected, which was either a sign of his temperament or his exhaustion from 3 days of driving, and probably a combination of both. Michael's office occupied the second floor of a brick building 2 blocks from the Flathead County Courthouse, and it smelled the way a serious law office should smell, like paper and coffee and the faint, reassuring odor of things being handled competently. Michael was already at his desk when Jack arrived at 7:55, and there were 3 large printouts spread across the conference table beside his computer. He had been there since 6, which he did not mention but which was obvious from the number of empty coffee cups. The county parcel records, Michael explained, were unambiguous. The legal description on Jack's deed, which had been recorded in 1993 and never altered, covered a contiguous 408-acre parcel running from the county road to the western shoreline of Silver Lake, bounded on the north by the Keller Creek drainage and on the south by the old fence line along what had once been the Harmon grazing allotment. He had overlaid the parcel boundary with a satellite image pulled from the county GIS system and marked it in red. The 14 houses of Silver Lake Estates sat entirely within the red boundary. All 14. Not partially entirely. There was not a single structure, road, or utility installation associated with the development that extended beyond the legal edge of Jack's property. The developer had not accidentally clipped a corner. They had built an entire gated community on someone else's land without, as far as Michael could determine, ever once acknowledging in any official capacity that the land was occupied. This was when Michael mentioned the name Ethan Bauer. Ethan was Jack's nearest neighbor, a retired high school geography teacher who lived on the parcel to the north and who, in Jack's absence, had served as a kind of informal watchman, someone who collected accumulated mail, chased off the occasional trespassing snowmobiler in winter, and called Jack when something seemed wrong. Jack had called Ethan that morning from the motel, and Ethan had told him something that Michael now confirmed from county records. A woman named Victoria Langford, representing a development company called Summit Meridian Properties, had contacted multiple landowners in the area approximately 18 months ago. She had made purchase offers on several parcels, including Jack's. Jack had not been in Montana at the time. He had been in Tucson for a shorter visit that had preceded the longer one, and the certified letter sent to his Montana address had gone unanswered. Ethan said Victoria had come to his door in person as well, asked questions about neighboring properties, and seemed particularly interested in the Silver Lake shoreline parcel. She had asked whether the owner was local, how often the property was visited, whether there had been any recent surveys. Ethan had told her it was none of his business to answer those questions and had shown her back to her car. He said she had left with the air of someone who had not been told anything she did not already know. That particular detail had stayed with Ethan, and it stayed with Jack now. Michael retrieved the certified letter that had been sent to Jack's Montana address. It had been signed for not by Jack, and the signature was illegible, and it made an offer to purchase the parcel for well below market value. There was no second letter, no follow-up. After the offer went unanswered, Summit Meridian Properties had apparently decided to proceed without the inconvenience of a response. Michael laid the satellite printout on the table and set his coffee cup on the corner and said, "All 14 are within your boundary, Jack. Every last one." Jack looked at the printout and then looked at the wall for a moment and then said, "All right," in the tone of a man who has decided what to do and is simply confirming the decision to himself out loud. The survey team arrived on the property the following Tuesday, contracted through a certified land survey company out of Great Falls that Michael had used before and trusted completely. There were 4 of them, and they spent the better part of 2 days walking the property lines, driving stakes, measuring angles with total station equipment, and cross-referencing their findings against the original government land survey monuments that had been set in the property corners in 1961 and, notably, had never been moved or disturbed. The results were precise and comprehensive and confirmed everything Michael's records review had suggested. 14 residential structures, 14 driveways, 14 utility connections, 2.5 miles of internal paved road, a clubhouse with a pool, an HOA management office with a parking lot. All of it, down to the last inch of curbing, within the legal boundary of Jack Merritt's property. The lead surveyor, a compact and serious woman named Dale Engstrom, who had spent 30 years walking Montana property lines in every kind of weather and had developed an economy of speech that bordered on the poetic, showed Jack the final plat map in the parking lot of the county assessor's office and said, "You've got 100% encroachment." "I've never done a survey where the answer was 100%. Jack thanked her. He photographed the map. Michael filed it with the county. There was one more thing Dale's crew found, And it was the thing that changed the nature of the story from a development error into something that deserved a different and less charitable name. On the second day of the survey, Dale's crew found stakes in the northeast corner of the property. Fresh stakes, recently driven, orange flagged, set in a pattern that was unmistakably the beginning of a new layout grid for additional construction. Dale had brought this to Jack's attention without commentary, pointing at the flags and stepping back in the manner of someone who has delivered a piece of news and prefers to let it land without embellishment. Jack had looked at the grid and looked at Michael, and Michael had looked at his phone, where he had been pulling the Summit Meridian Properties permit applications from the county planning portal for the past 20 minutes. There was a Phase 2 application submitted 4 months ago and approved 2 months ago for an additional 8 residential units on the northern portion of the parcel. The application listed the land as unimproved, privately held by Summit Meridian Properties. It did not mention Jack Merritt. It listed no prior owner. The approval had come through without an independent title search, apparently because the planning department had relied on the documentation Summit Meridian provided without verifying it. Phase 2, if it had proceeded on schedule, would have brought the total to 22 houses. They had been 6 weeks away from breaking ground. Michael's office that evening was very quiet except for the sound of him typing. Jack sat in the chair across the desk and did not pace, did not raise his voice, did not say anything inflammatory, because none of those things would have been useful, and Jack Merritt was, at his core, a deeply practical man. Michael reviewed the permits, the plat filings, the environmental assessments, the utility connection agreements, and the HOA formation documents that had been filed with the state. What he found in those documents was not the comfortable story of a bureaucratic oversight, a surveying error, a chain of honest mistakes made by people who should have known better and simply hadn't. What he found was a deliberate sequence of alterations. The permit application for Phase 1 had listed GPS boundary coordinates that differed from the county parcel record by a precise offset, not a rounding error, not a data entry slip, but a systematic shift of the boundary polygon that moved it, on paper, off Jack's parcel and onto an adjacent strip of unincorporated land that had been classified, incorrectly, as state-owned open space. The original county notice of the permit application, which would normally have been mailed to the landowner of record, had been sent to an address in California that did not appear anywhere in Jack's title history. The response period had elapsed without comment. The permit had issued cleanly. When the Phase 1 construction had proceeded and a title company had flagged a potential ownership discrepancy during the initial HOA formation, flagged it in a memo, clearly, in writing, with a specific recommendation to investigate before proceeding. That memo had been received by Victoria Langford's office, acknowledged, and filed without any corrective action taken. The warning had existed. It had been read. It had been set aside. Michael pulled up the flagged memo on his screen and turned the monitor so Jack could see it. The date on the memo was 11 months ago. Construction had continued for 9 full months after that memo was received and filed. 9 months of concrete and timber and drywall and landscaping and furniture deliveries and families signing mortgage documents in good faith, and none of it had been stopped. Jack looked at the screen and then looked at the window, where the lights of Kalispell were coming on in the early evening dark, and said nothing for a long time. Victoria Langford's name appeared at the top of the acknowledgement line on that memo. Her initials VL were in the margin. She had read it. She had understood it. And she had decided to keep going. The attorney for Silver Lake Estates HOA called Jack's cell phone at 8:14 the following morning. His name was Gregory Penn, and he had a voice that had been professionally calibrated to project both warmth and subtle authority simultaneously, the kind of voice that had probably served him well in mediation rooms for many years. He introduced himself pleasantly, acknowledged that there appeared to be some boundary questions that needed to be addressed between the parties, and expressed his client's sincere desire to resolve the situation quickly and collaboratively. He used the word collaborative 3 times in the first 2 minutes. He suggested that a preliminary conversation between principals might be more productive than an adversarial posture at this early stage. He noted that the homeowners, and here his voice shifted just slightly, adding a carefully measured note of pathos, were families, many of them with children, who had invested their savings in good faith. He did not say Jack should consider that. He did not need to. The implication was laid out like a welcome mat. Please feel obligated to moderate your response for the sake of people who had nothing to do with this. Jack listened to all of it without interrupting, and when Penn finished, Jack said, "My attorney is Michael Hargrove in Kalispell. All communications go through him." Penn said he understood completely, and that he looked forward to a productive dialogue. Jack ended the call and texted Michael the attorney's name and number. Michael replied with a single word, "Good." An hour later, Michael called Jack back and said, in a tone that was not triumphant but was something in the neighborhood of it, "I know exactly what they did, Jack. Every step of it. I know which documents were altered. I know when. And I know who signed the filings." He paused. Gregory Penn is going to have a very difficult week. Michael filed suit in Flathead County District Court on Thursday. The complaint ran to 41 pages. It named Summit Meridian Properties, Silver Lake Estates, HOA LLC, Victoria Langford individually, and 3 individuals from the county planning department whose signatures appeared on the altered permit applications. The causes of action included trespass, encroachment, cloud on title, fraudulent misrepresentation in a land use proceeding, civil conspiracy, and conversion of real property. The filing also included a motion for an immediate temporary restraining order halting all construction activity on the property, all property sales by the HOA, and all new utility connections pending resolution of the dispute. The TRO was granted by the district court judge the same afternoon, within 4 hours of filing, because Michael had included the title warning memo with Victoria Langford's initials in the margin, and the judge had apparently decided that a document like that warranted expedited attention. The county planning department suspended the Phase 2 permit that evening, pending an internal review that had been requested in terms that were not entirely optional. Phase 2, all 8 future houses, was dead before it had poured a single foundation. There was also, Michael explained to Jack that evening on the phone, a separate legal principle at work that was worth understanding clearly. Under Montana property law, as in most states, structures built on someone else's land without permission do not automatically belong to the builder. They belong to the landowner. The legal doctrine dating back to common law principles that predated Montana's statehood by several centuries held that improvements made to real property attached to the land and followed the land's title. This meant that not only were the 14 houses encroachments, they were encroachments that, absent any other agreement, enhanced the value of Jack's property rather than Summit Meridian's. The developer had spent months and millions of dollars building on Jack's land and had, in doing so, been improving Jack's asset without Jack's knowledge or permission. This was the legal reality that Gregory Penn was going to walk into his next conversation with, and it was the reason he had called Jack's cell phone with warmth and collaboration in his voice before the ink on the court filing was dry. Jack absorbed this information and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "So all 14. Michael said, "All 14. Jack said, "All right." He had said that phrase, in that tone, twice now in the span of 4 days, and each time it meant the same thing. The effect on the development was immediate and visible. Jack drove past the entrance the morning after the TRO was filed and could see, from the highway, that the construction staging area that had been set up in the northeast corner of the property was empty. The equipment was gone. 2 large flatbed trucks were parked at the gate, apparently waiting for instructions that were not coming. The woman with the golden retriever was standing in her front yard talking to a man Jack did not recognize, and both of them were looking at something on the man's phone with expressions that had shed the pleasant unconcern of the previous week entirely. The first homeowner came to Jack's motel room on Friday evening. His name was Paul Whitmore, and he was a civil engineer from Billings who had purchased one of the Silver Lake Estates homes 8 months ago as a retirement property, paying for it with money he had spent 30 years accumulating. He knocked on Jack's door at 6 o'clock, identified himself through the door, and when Jack opened it, he said, "Without preamble, I drove past your truck at the gate every morning for 6 months, and I need to understand what is happening to my home." Jack invited him in. He explained, methodically and without editorializing, what his deed said, what Michael's title search had found, what the survey had confirmed, and what the court filing contained. He showed Paul Whitmore the title warning memo with Victoria Langford's initials. Paul Whitmore read it twice. He sat back in the chair and rubbed his face with both hands and said, "We were told this was a clean title. They showed us all the documents." Jack said he knew. He said he understood. Paul asked what was going to happen to the homeowners, whether they were going to lose their houses, whether they were going to lose the money they had paid. Jack said that was a question for the court, but that he was not interested in putting 14 families on the street. He said that anyone who had purchased in good faith from Summit Meridian was a victim of the same fraud he was a victim of, not a participant in it, and that he had no intention of treating them as though they were something else. Paul Whitmore listened to that very carefully, the way a man listens when a sentence contains the difference between catastrophe and manageable disaster. When he left, an hour later, he shook Jack's hand at the door and said he would like Jack to know that he intended to speak to the other homeowners. Jack said that was entirely Paul's business. The following morning, 2 more residents came to the motel. By Sunday, 7 of the 14 households had made contact with Jack or with Michael's office, and every conversation had the same shape. These were people who had been sold a clean transaction by a developer who had known for 11 months that the transaction was not clean. Their anger, once it had somewhere to point, pointed directly and specifically at Victoria Langford. The formal investigation opened on Monday, 11 days after Jack had braked his truck at the top of the ridge and looked at the asphalt for the first time. The Montana Department of Justice opened a civil inquiry into Summit Meridian Properties' permitting practices and the handling of the title discrepancy memo. The county planning department placed the 3 employees named in Michael's complaint on administrative leave pending an internal review of their role in approving the altered permit application. One of those 3 employees, a permit review technician named Dennis Falk, who had been with the county for 12 years, had apparently not known what he was signing, had been told the boundary coordinates were a corrected version of a prior filing error, and had not independently verified that claim. The other 2 had known more than Dennis Falk, and the distance between what Dennis Falk had known and what the other 2 had known was going to be a significant part of what the DOJ's inquiry was trying to measure. Gregory Penn filed a motion to withdraw from representing the HOA, which the court denied on procedural grounds, and filed it again 2 days later, which the court denied again with a note that suggested the judge found the timing of the withdrawal request to be worthy of comment. Victoria Langford had not appeared in court, had not responded to service of process at her Missoula office address, and had been located by process servers at a hotel in Salt Lake City, which was either a previously scheduled business trip or the early stages of an attempt to establish meaningful physical distance from a situation that was acquiring legal mass at a considerable rate. The HOA's management company, a firm called Highline Community Services, suspended its contract with Silver Lake Estates, pending resolution of the litigation, which left the development without active management for its common areas. The pool was closed. The lawn maintenance contractor stopped showing up. Small administrative details of the kind that residential communities generate constantly: gate codes, utility billing, snow removal contracts for the coming winter began to go unanswered. The 14 families of Silver Lake Estates found themselves in possession of beautiful houses on stolen land with a management structure that was dissolving around them in real time, and they had not done anything wrong. Victoria Langford resigned from her position as principal of Summit Meridian Properties on the Thursday of the 3rd week. In a letter filed with the Montana Secretary of State's office that was written in the kind of careful, passive-voiced legal prose that communicates a great deal by declining to say anything at all, she expressed her commitment to an orderly resolution of outstanding business matters. She noted her confidence in the company's legal team. She mentioned, in a sentence that had clearly been drafted and redrafted several times before settling into its final anodyne form, that she wished the Silver Lake Estates community the very best in its future as a residential neighborhood. She did not use the word fraud. She did not use the word trespass. She did not use the word sorry. She did not use the name Jack Merritt. By this point, Michael had obtained a subpoena for Summit Meridian's financial records, and what those records showed, after a forensic accountant named Carol Stensrud spent 4 days with them at a conference table covered in printed spreadsheets and highlighted bank statements, was a project that had been financed in layers, development loans, investor funds, pre-sale deposits from home buyers, and that had never, at any point in its financial history, included a line item for the cost of actually acquiring the land it was built on. The land acquisition budget was zero. It had been zero from the very beginning of the project's financial planning. There was a line in the early stage pro forma for site control costs that had been filled in as zero and had remained zero through every subsequent revision of the budget. Carol Stensrud highlighted that line in yellow and circled it twice, which she noted was the first time in her professional career she had considered a zero to be the most alarming number in a document. The business model, if one was being precise about it, had depended entirely on Jack Merritt remaining in Arizona long enough for the situation to become, in Victoria's calculation, too settled to be unsettled. She had counted on his absence the way a business plan counts on a favorable interest rate as an assumption baked into the model, a condition that the whole structure required in order to stand. The negotiation lasted 9 days. Michael and Gregory Penn, who was still representing the HOA despite his sustained best efforts not to be, met twice in person and exchanged 14 rounds of written proposals. The State Department of Justice's Civil Division sat in on the second in-person meeting, which clarified everyone's remaining negotiating incentives considerably and accelerated the timeline in ways that Mr. Penn had probably not anticipated when he had requested the meeting. There were moments in those 9 days when the negotiations stalled, when Summit Meridian's liquidators pushed back on the valuation figures, when the investor group threatened to file their own cross-claims, when one of the planning department employees retained his own attorney and began making statements that complicated everyone's position simultaneously. Michael navigated all of it with the unhurried precision of someone who had spent 11 years reading every document Jack had ever signed and who had, as a result, a complete and detailed picture of what the property was worth and what it had cost and what was owed. Jack came to the office each morning and sat across the desk and drank Michael's coffee and waited, because waiting was what the situation required, and Jack Merritt had enough experience with patience to know that it was not the same thing as passivity. The final settlement agreement, reached on a Wednesday afternoon with a light rain falling on the Flathead Valley and the mountains going gray in the early dark, resolved the matter in the following terms. Silver Lake Estates HOA was formally dissolved as a legal entity, effective immediately. Its assets, the common areas, the clubhouse, the pool, the internal road infrastructure, were transferred to Jack at no cost, as partial satisfaction of the trespass and conversion damages. The 14 homeowners, all of whom had purchased in good faith and had been defrauded by Summit Meridian's representations, were issued corrected deeds reflecting their actual lot boundaries and valid title derived from Jack, who conveyed the underlying land in exchange for fair market value payments funded by the liquidation of Summit Meridian's remaining project accounts and a portion of the investor escrow funds that the Department of Justice had frozen early in its inquiry. Every family that had bought a home at Silver Lake Estates received clean title to their lot. Every family that had been left without HOA management received a clear legal framework for forming a new, voluntary neighborhood association free of the dissolved entity's liabilities and free of anyone named Victoria Langford. Jack received compensation for 7 months of unauthorized use of his land, for the surveying and legal costs, for the tidal cloud damages, and for the loss of the timber and ground cover that had been cleared during construction without his knowledge or consent. The total monetary compensation was not a small number. It was the kind of number that a retired man with a lake property in Montana might describe, if he were the kind of man who talked about money, as sufficient. The Phase 2 survey stakes were pulled by a county contractor the week after the settlement was signed. The orange flags were gone within a day. The cleared ground in the northeast corner of the property, where 8 more houses had nearly been planted before anyone had noticed the absence of a legitimate deed, went back to raw earth, and by October the first frosts were coming down from the mountains and the frost-killed grasses were beginning their slow work of reclaiming the disturbed soil. Jack watched this from the end of the gravel road, the old gravel road he had rebuilt once the asphalt's legal status was fully sorted, and thought that the land had a considerably longer memory than most of the people who transacted over it. The evening after the settlement was signed, Jack drove to the property and parked at the cul-de-sac above the northern shore, the same place he had parked the first time he had driven through, and sat there with the engine off. The lake was doing what it always did in early autumn, going dark blue and then purple and then a deep charcoal as the light died. The mountains on the far shore catching the last of the orange for longer than the water, the way they always did. Ethan Bauer came down from his place on the north parcel around 6, walking the fence line the way he sometimes did in the evenings when the weather was decent, and stopped when he saw the truck. He came around to the passenger window and Jack let him in and gave him the other cup of coffee from the thermos, because he had started packing 2 cups after the Tucson trip out of a habit he could not fully explain and had not tried to. They sat together and watched the lake in the way that 2 men who have known each other for many years can sit without the pressure of conversation filling every silence with something. After a long time, Ethan said, "She really thought you weren't coming back." Jack considered this for a moment. He said, "She thought I'd be gone long enough for the concrete to cure and the furniture to go in and the whole thing to become too complicated to undo. An accomplished fact, something that would cost more to fix than to live with." Ethan nodded slowly. He said, "Almost worked." Jack said, "Almost" is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. He looked at the houses down the shoreline road, their lights coming on one by one in the descending dark, families inside doing the ordinary things families do at the end of a day, cooking dinner, checking on children, moving through rooms in the warm yellow light. Paul Whitmore's house had a light in every window. The golden retriever lady's house had a wreath on the front door that had not been there a week ago. 14 houses, still standing, still occupied, now legally and properly grounded in a chain of title that would hold up to any examination any court might ever care to make. The HOA sign was gone from the gate. The gate itself was still there, propped open, though Jack intended to remove it in the spring. He had no use for a gate. He had never needed one before. The squirrel was back, or a squirrel, possibly the same one he had watched from the cul-de-sac the first evening on the stone post at the edge of the turnaround, moving with the focused urgency of a creature that understood, at some cellular level, that the season was finite and that preparation was not optional. Jack watched it for a moment. It paid him no attention. It knew whose land it was on and was going about its business accordingly, which was more than could be said for certain parties to the recent proceedings. "You need anything from town before winter?" Ethan asked. Jack said he didn't think so. He said he had bought enough supplies in Kalispell to last until December, and that after December he would reassess. They finished their coffee. Ethan said good night and walked back up along the fence line, disappearing into the trees in the way that people who are comfortable on a piece of land disappear into it. Jack stayed until the last color left the sky and the lake went flat black, and the lights in the 14 houses were the brightest things visible from where he sat. He thought about Victoria Langford in her Salt Lake City hotel room, or wherever she was now, working through whatever calculations she was working through about what came next for her. He thought about the memo with her initials in the margin, sitting in a filing cabinet for 11 months, while the concrete trucks made their rounds and the sod was laid and the mailboxes were installed and the welcome mat was embedded in the gate arch. He thought about the certified letter sent to his Montana address, the one she had assumed would go unanswered because she had assumed he would stay in Arizona, because she had counted on his continued and indefinite absence as a structural element of her business plan. The land had not cooperated with that plan. The land had corner monuments set in 1961 that did not move and did not forget and did not care about anyone's financial model. The county records had not cooperated. Michael Hargrove had not cooperated. The survey instruments had not cooperated. And Jack Merritt had come home when he was ready to come home, which had turned out to be exactly when he was needed. He started the truck. He drove back through the open gate, down the road that was his, past the lamp post that was his, past the 14 houses that sat on his land under deeds he had conveyed in a settlement, signed in a conference room in Kalispell. He pulled out onto the county highway and pointed the truck toward the cabin, the old cabin at the edge of the tree line, where he had always parked and always come in through the back door and always put the kettle on before he did anything else. The pines on either side of the road were dark against the last light. A deer stood at the edge of the tree line 50 yards ahead and watched him pass with the patient and unhurried attention of something that lived here and had no particular reason to be anywhere else. Jack slowed for it, and it watched him, and then it was gone back into the dark between the trees. He thought, on that short drive from the cul-de-sac to the cabin, about the difference between what had happened and what had almost happened, not in terms of legal outcomes, those were settled now, documented, filed, but in terms of the margin between a development that became permanent and a development that was undone, was the length of a drive from Tucson to Montana. It was 7 months measured against 31 years of ownership. It was the gap between a certified letter going unanswered and a man coming home. Victoria had understood that margin and had tried to use it. She had studied the property records, identified the ownership, established that Jack was absent, confirmed through Ethan's neighbor to the north that the visits were infrequent, and made a calculation about how much time she had and how much money she could move through the project before the calculation was tested. The calculation had been detailed and deliberate and had been based on real information. It had simply been based on the wrong assumption about how long a man stays away from the land he loves. He said, to no one in particular, or perhaps to the truck, or perhaps simply to the record, the same way a man might state a fact to himself that he wants to remember clearly. Victoria had thought he would be in Arizona long enough for the concrete to dry and the gardens to root, and for all of it to become something that belonged to time and inertia instead of to the law. She had miscalculated one thing, and it was the same thing that people who build on other people's land always miscalculate. The land was still his. The law remembered that. It remembered it in the parcel records and the survey monuments and the title history and the deed recorded in 1993, and it remembered it with a precision and a permanence that no amount of asphalt or landscaping or cheerful signage about community standards had managed to overwrite. The kettle, when he got inside, took 4 minutes to boil. He stood at the window and looked at the lake while he waited. The same lake he had looked at from the cul-de-sac an hour ago, seen now from the other side, from the cabin side, from the side where it had always been and where he had always looked at it. The water was black and still. The lights of the houses down the shore were small and yellow and distant and entirely ordinary. The way lights in houses always are from a distance, the way they suggest warmth and order, and people settled in for the evening without telling you anything complicated about how they got there or what it had cost to make it right. He thought about Paul Whitmore, who had driven 3 hours from Billings to knock on a motel door and ask a stranger about his home with the raw anxiety of a man who had worked 30 years for the thing he was afraid of losing. He thought about the woman with the golden retriever, whose name he had learned from Michael's HOA records was Sandra Cahill, and who had come to his door on the Saturday of the second week, not to argue, but to bring him a jar of huckleberry jam she had put up herself and to say, simply, that she was glad someone was paying attention. He thought about the 14 families who had bought a product from a company that had never owned what it was selling, and who had been caught in the middle of something they had had no way of seeing coming. He had not wanted their houses. He had never wanted their houses. He had wanted his land, and the two things, it turned out, were not the same thing and could be handled as not the same thing, and that was what a settlement agreement was for. He thought about Michael Hargrove, who had been at his desk at 6 in the morning reviewing parcel records, who had filed a 41-page complaint in under 72 hours, and who had navigated 9 days of negotiations with the focused patience of someone who knew the answer and was simply waiting for everyone else to arrive at it. Jack made a note to himself to send Michael something better than a standard referral thank you, something that acknowledged the specific quality of attention the situation had required. He had not yet decided what. He had time to decide. The kettle boiled. Jack poured the water. He sat down at the table by the window, and the lake was there, and the mountains were there beyond it, and the night was very quiet, and everything was, at last, exactly where it was supposed to be.